Would you like to understand the power dynamics in the Middle East better than you currently do? If so, you're going to love this episode. We go deep into the details. If you're curious about what role Syria is trying to play in the future of this region, what emerging role Azerbaijan is already playing, and why this country is suddenly a massive strategic asset for the neighboring countries, and how the regional powerhouses are adapting, Iran, Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, to this new landscape. If so, you're going to love this episode. My guest is Dr. Kamran Bokhari. He's a founder and senior director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington. He focuses on Eurasia and Central Asia. And today we get in deep. Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Here is Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
Here I am with Kamran Bokhari. Kamran, it's great to have you on the program. I'm really looking forward to pulling some intelligence out of your brain over the next hour or so. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Jay.
So I want to maybe break our conversation up sort of region by region. I want to start in the Middle East, and maybe one of the more complex regions for people to understand because of the storied histories and ideologies, religions, and ethnicities. It's a very fluid region and part of the world that's been subject to a lot of chaos and conflicts very recently. So if somebody is beginning to understand, maybe let's start with Syria, a country that I feel like has been or become a bit of a tipping point for many nations. And there's so many fingers in that pie right now. Turkey's got interest. Saudi Arabia's got interest. Azerbaijan's got interest. Iran's got interest. Would you agree that Syria is very strategically important right now? And if so, what are the incentives for all parties who are trying to motivate the outcome of that political regime?
Well, look, going back to the Arab Spring, post 2011, I started calling Syria a multi-actor battle space. Multi-actor because the country has many internal cleavages, sectarian, ethnic, regional. And so that creates multiple actors inside the country, domestic actors. We saw that with just sort of the alphabet soup of different rebel groups fighting the Assad regime in the early days of the Arab Spring from, say, 2011 to 2016. Then they weren't alone. And you have, external actors with interests, like any region. The surrounding countries have interests. If a country goes south or sort of starts to fragment and there's turmoil, civil war, unrest, all the neighbors are affected and they just can't stay out. And then those are sort of the immediate ones that have borders. And then there are those who are distant but still have interests. So if you go through the list, you have Turkey, which has a border with Syria. You have Israel. Iran doesn't have a border with Syria, but it always has seen, especially this regime in Iran, has seen Syria as sort of the, if you will, the core element in its contiguous sphere of influence that it established and recently lost, stretching from its borders all the way to the Mediterranean. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is the big financial heavyweight in the region. It's one of the largest producers of crude and, of course, exporters. And so its tool is financial, but nonetheless, it has interest in the region, especially in a country like Syria. Then you have Russia, that for the longest time supported the Assad regime. But in the wake of the war in Ukraine, its ability to shape the outcome of Syria declined quite seriously, to the point where it could not protect the Assad regime from the overthrow last December. Then you have other smaller players like Qatar and UAE that are key actors because, again, they are major energy exporters and they have financial heft, and therefore that gets them influence. So they have an interest as well. And then, of course, there's Syria, which is at the moment the most powerful nation in the region. So you have, all these players that are then having to deal with the turmoil in the country that's been ongoing, and it continues. It hasn't ended. It's just metamorphed into a different phase after the fall of the Assad regime 7 months ago. And so I think that this is going to be the case for the long haul, but primarily with Iran on severely weakened, Russia severely weakened. You have it is essentially a two-player game. If you had to sort of distill it, it's between Turkey and Israel, but with countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, the United States, of course, as the superpower, and then of course the rising influence of Azerbaijan on its southern flank as well, which is not technically part of the Middle East. It's in the South Caucasus, but in geopolitics, these distinctions kind of blur.
Sure. Okay. So, would I be correct to say that the current American administration's policy in regions like this has attempted to nominate local leaders, right? Local groups to kind of drive regional policy, allowing the United States to take a step back. And I don't know how effective, if that's accurate, I don't know how effective it's been, but what would you say about that?
That's absolutely correct. So this administration, and even we can go back all the way to the Obama administration days. Washington's posture has been, especially in the wake of the failures of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the lessons learned from there, has been, look, the United States needs to engage in sort of a classic balance of power strategy for the world. And each region has allies and partner nations and stakeholders, and they need to be balanced. Now, if you apply that to the model to the Middle East, you basically have four major powers. You have Turkey, Israel, Iran, and the Saudis, Saudi Arabia. Those are the four major powers. And this is probably one of those regions where the imbalance of power is the most acute throughout the world. There's still a method to the madness, surrounding Ukraine and Europe and Russia. There is a logic by which the Western Pacific operates East Asia with China and our allies stretching from Japan, South Korea, all the way down to Australia, New Zealand. But in this region, the volatility is just, very high. It's safe to say it's the most volatile region of the world. And the United States strategy to get regional players to take the lead, as opposed to the U.S. doing the heavy lifting, that's been the case since World War II. That strategy is running into challenges. And if you go back to Syria, you have a situation where you have two allies of the United States in conflict with one another, and the Turks and the Israelis. Mm-hmm. The Turks are NATO allies, but obviously that relationship has evolved. Turkey wants to has great power ambitions, so interests always don't converge. In a different way, Israeli and U.S. interests also tend to diverge, but again, it's an ally, a long-standing ally, one of the closest allies, or perhaps the closest ally of the United States in that region. But being allies does not mean that they're going to see eye to eye on everything. And the way in which the U.S. is now caught between the Turks and the Israelis is very telling of this, and it's only natural. It's not right. It's not wrong. It is what it is. From the Israeli point of view, the new Syrian regime is a threat because it's led by an Islamist movement that not too long ago was affiliated with AQ, Al Qaeda, and that broader relationship with ISIS. And the Israelis look at that and say, well, do we want this government on our northern flank? Mm-hmm. But the challenge for the Israelis, and I would say even for the Americans, and has been for quite some time, is there is a geosectarian logic in the region that we just can't seem to extricate ourselves from it. It's almost like a causality loop. So you fight ISIS and Sunni jihadists, and it creates a vacuum. Who fills that vacuum? Iran and its Shia radical camp. And then when you try to roll back them, you have the resurgence of the Sunni Islamists or Sunni jihadists, as we've now seen in the case of Syria, especially with the government led by President Ahmed al-Shara. And so this is something that they haven't been able to break orbit from. They're stuck in this sort of gravity well of the region. And that's what it is. I mean, if you look at it, until fairly recently, Israel and the United States were trying to roll back Iranian influence. Now, once that is done, and here's where you see the sort of the divergence between the American and Israeli position. The American position is that Iran was the problem. This is a Sunni Arab majority country. It is supported by our two main allies, almost all our allies in the region, namely the Turks, the Saudis, and the UAE, and we want to stabilize. We can't pick and choose our partners. It would be nice if we had, secular Syrian nationalists who were trying to form a government, but that's not the reality. The reality is that you have this Islamist movement that has parted ways with AQ. It's ideologically in transition. We don't know what that transition will look like, but this is what the hand that we've been dealt with, and we have to deal with it. From an Israeli point of view, that is true, but at the same time, the United States doesn't live here. We are in the region, and we share a border. So there we have, sort of a classic strategic geopolitical divergence in terms of perspectives and interests.
Okay, let me ask you a couple of questions on that front. First of all, when you talk about the gravity well, immediately I began thinking, is that actually part of the strategy? Destabilization of a region is a strategy that America has employed many times over. Is that intentional? I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And then maybe as a follow-up to that, you discussed the four most powerful countries in the region. And I think I understand the strengths of each. Saudi Arabia, obviously, it's money, right? World's largest producer and exporter of oil, very well capitalized. Turkey, it's military. I think second biggest military of any NATO country and developing rapidly. Israel, you might just say U.S. ally. Maybe that's the ace up their sleeve. I'm less clear.
Militarily the most powerful country in the region.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, of course. So military as well as Turkey, cash for Saudi Arabia, and commodity significance. Iran, I'm less clear on. And is that still the case given the recent culling of Iranian leaders?
So Iran is a large country by area. It's a little smaller than Alaska, okay, just to give some context to our listeners. And imagine 93 million people living in Alaska. So that's sort of like that's a huge country. It's very diverse. There are, a quarter of all Iranian nationals, give or take, are of ethnically Azeri. You have a sizable Kurdish minority population in the northwest, and just adjacent to the ethnic Azeri regions in the northwest. You come down that flank towards the south, and you run into ethnic Arabs. You swing over to the southeast near the border with Pakistan and Afghanistan. You have an ethnic Baloch, who are not just ethnically different. From a sectarian point of view, they're not Shia, they're Sunni. And so this is a very large, very diverse country that is also a major oil producer, at least has massive reserves of both natural gas and oil. But because of the sanctions, because of the hostility between the United States and this regime since its founding in 1979, its potential hasn't been realized. and it's going through a what I call an evolutionary regime change, where the theocracy is shot. I mean, the theocracy is just sort of like it's almost gone. And once the supreme leader passes, he's 85. The locus of power, which is already shifted to the military, will that whole process will sort of culminate. It'll be a culminating moment for that process that's been underway for the last 15 years. But the problem is there is no one military in Iran. And Iran's has, the more well-known Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. That's sort of this elite military that also has, its hands in the economy of the country, in the industrial sectors, in the oil production, in telecommunications, domestic crowd control, you name it, they're there. But then on the other hand, you have a much larger professional, more Iranian nationalist force called the regular armed forces, or the name is Artesh, Artesh, in the local lingo. And they are two militaries. So if the clerics are out and this country is not, this change is not going to produce democracy, you're looking at a military dominated regime. But two militaries, how are they going to get along? How do they divide power and authority amongst them? And how do they work with civilian politicians that will gain an opportunity to, advance themselves as well because of the decline of the clergy? The next supreme leader, in my opinion, is going to be a puppet in the hands of the military. And so this is another country that we don't know where it's going. So that's why I think that in the U.S. strategy, we're more clear about how to proceed with Turkey, Saudi, Israel, and even Syria, which is not a major power, but sort of the center of gravity of the region right now. But we don't know what to do with Iran because it's not there yet. It has to undergo its own. It has to sort itself out.
And safe to say, you mentioned their oil power, and yes, top 3 oil reserves globally, top 3 gas reserves, natural gas reserve globally, and it might even be top 2, but it's relatively undeveloped, so we don't know with absolute clarity. And sanctions aside, I believe they supply 50% of China's oil through their shadow fleet, right? These are sort of dark ships that sail without GPS engagement, so they can fly under radar and deliver to China's, they're called teapot refineries, that are sort of like independent, off balance sheet, where they can receive this oil with a bit more flexibility and therefore plausible deniability that they're buying oil at like $11 discount per barrel. Which leads me to believe Iran's incredibly important to China. If this is supplying 50% of your oil, this is an asset you cannot let go into the wrong hands. Is that accurate, do you think?
Yeah, but it's definitely an imperative for the Chinese. But the question is, what are the Chinese going to be able to do about it? Clearly, when Israel launched its offensive against Iran, the 12-day war last month, the Chinese issued statements. They weren't actually able to do anything. Likewise, Russia, which has far more sort of an active presence. The relationship between Moscow and Tehran is far more developed and strategic than the one between Beijing and Tehran. If the Russians couldn't do anything, what are the Chinese going to do? I will say that to your point about being a large oil exporter. So one of the things that has been sort of brewing inside Iran is this debate between several different camps. So there are multiple camps and subcamps, but for purposes of our conversation, let's just say those who are sort of more ideological and those who are more pragmatic. So I mean, it's a superficial way of looking at it, but for the point that I'm making, it works. So the ideologues have been sort of in charge for a long time, and they've been sort of pushing forward with this very assertive, aggressive foreign policy, trying to penetrate and create outposts and spheres of influence in the Arab world. And that has cost the country quite a bit. So the pragmatists, who are not one camp, there are a bunch of different factions, but let's lump them together. They have been saying, look, why is it that with all these resources, natural resources, we're not able to make money? We're not able to export, whereas our Arab rivals on the other side of the Persian Gulf are pumping oil and gas and exporting it like there's no tomorrow. And so this has been a gripe, a major, if you will, issue for the Iranians, for the pragmatists within the Iranians, who I think are now going to, with the hammering of the IRGC and the taking down of its leadership and the weakening of that institution, I think that the regular armed forces and all the other their pragmatist allies, I think they are now seeing their moment. Can they actually take advantage of it? That remains to be seen. But they do want, and I think this is what this White House, the Trump White House, is interested in, is that can we do business with you? It's the same logic by which the Trump administration is approaching Putin on the war in Ukraine. It's the same logic that we have towards China. That, I mean, if you look at the comments of Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he's basically saying, look, if we can sort out the trade issues, then we can make headway. And supposedly they're having talks this Monday and Tuesday in Stockholm in Sweden. And so, I think it's this White House is saying if we can ease out of conflicts and focus on geoeconomics, then that's good for the United States and that's good for the other nations that we're trying to steer away from conflict.
So, I mean, two things come to mind when and thank you for that. The sort of conflict or whatever between the ideologues and the pragmatists in Iran, and I think I understand that. And I grew up in Vancouver with a bazillion Iranian friends, and actually, question before I get into this, we recently had some family in Tehran when they were getting bombed. We were able to get them into Azerbaijan and then to a friend's place in Armenia. Right now there's a lot of imagery being circulated about Iran in the 70s. And it shows kind of like a much more liberal society, very artistic, almost like beach vacation vibes. But you could tell a story in many different ways. How accurate of a description of pre 1980 Iran is that, or is that just little highlights?
No, it's pretty accurate. I mean, you have YouTube footage, and so it's very accurate. You actually have similar footage from pre 1979 Afghanistan as well. So it wasn't just Iran; it was that entire region. We hadn't seen sort of this surge of ideological, Islamism and its influence over society and states. And it shifted the behavior, shifted the cultural norms of not just Iran, but a good chunk of that broader Southwest Asian region. So that's absolutely true. I think that the diaspora of any country kind of harkens back to an age that they are familiar with or they have been sort of socialized in. So a lot of the diaspora, say in LA or in Toronto or in the Vancouver area and other parts of North America, and we can even go over to the other side of the pond and look up cases on the European continent. They largely left shortly after the revolution. And so obviously a lot of Iranians were born in the West, but they grew up listening to their parents and their grandparents telling them stories about, an Iran that did not have these problems, an Iran that was not behind at least in terms of cultural sophistication and economic opportunities than the West. So, or not too far behind. So that's sort of the imagery that sort of develops, and it's not just an imagery; it's also sort of an aspiration. Can we get back to that point?
Because that's recent memory. That's lived experience of people today.
Yeah, I mean, it's only 46 years old, so that's not too far in the past. But I think the way forward is far more difficult. And I always think that the future, in other words, there's just no going back to what was in its pure original form. There are cycles of history. There are cyclical trends things rise and fall, and people and nations revert back to certain things, but in a newer form. So I think that the path forward is going to be a difficult one. Uh, the key thing is what happens to this regime. Uh, Worst case scenario, and I'm not forecasting here, I'm just presenting a scenario, is that, this regime doesn't make it to the other side intact.
Mm-hmm.
And you have infighting. And you have infighting at multiple levels, not just between the, various, factions with the guns, but also between different communities that I mentioned earlier. So that's one very, if you will, doomsday-ish outcome. On the other side is the likelihood that they do sort of get to the other side, more or less intact, and there's a slow evolution. So the next supreme leader comes in and says, "Hey, you know what? We shouldn't be so restrictive with women and social norms. We should give some freedoms, and we shouldn't be sort of so hostile to the West, and that will create opportunities for investments." This country hasn't seen Western investment or any investment in a long time. We need to have a genuine private sector as opposed to sort of the monopoly that the IRGC has in manufacturing and in industry. And so you see that kind of thing. So what I'm trying to say here is that the road ahead is long, uncertain, and difficult. But Iran is at a very historic moment in its evolution in this current moment. How long this moment lasts, it's very difficult to say because there's so many moving parts. And it will have repercussions for not just Iran and the Middle East. There's a reason why Azerbaijan is getting involved on its southern flank because it's just north of Iran. And Azerbaijan, until the early 1800s, was under the control of the Persian Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russians defeated the Persians and took that area, the whole South Caucasus, including Dagestan, which is neighbors Chechnya and is part of the North Caucasus. That was all part of the Persian Empire. So the point that I'm trying to make is that whatever happens in Iran has implications for the southern flank of Russia, for Turkey, for Central Asia, for South Asia, definitely for the Persian Gulf. I mean, this is a large country strategically located with a lot of resources. And we already see a shatter belt all around it. Now, if this place were to go south, then that we can see that shatter belt expanding.
You mentioned two outcomes, and I just noticed there wasn't a third. One was regime change that effectively lands the country in military disputes and chaos. You described that as the sort of the doomsday scenario, which obviously nobody wants. And the other being a regime evolution, right? The regime's been threatened. It evolves, it adapts over time, bends to a degree to the demands of the population. I imagine that's what you're hinting at, and becomes more liberal in certain ways over time. And that's the peaceful process. However,
not necessarily peaceful, but less chaotic.
Sure. Good context. Yes. Thank you for that. Okay. Yeah. Simultaneously, the Israeli prime minister and the American president have implicitly and explicitly called for regime change in Iran. The first of those two options, which by your analysis leads to the doomsday conflict scenario. What would you say to somebody who says, no, there's a path forward here? The pragmatists, we need to support them. We need to get Iran's economy online. They have a lot to offer the world from a resource standpoint, from a coastline standpoint. They're the valve that connects the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. That's all the Gulf state oil. And this is a strategic asset that we should help support. And, any student of history would say, let's look at the track record of supporting regime change, and, let's maybe look at how that's turned out. But having said that, it's all over the headlines, and two of our most powerful leaders in the world are calling for that outcome. What would you have to say about that?
Well, I mean, let's parse those out. I mean, I saw a report today quoting the Israeli prime minister that saying that this is if the regime is to be changed, it'll have to happen from within.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? I mean, look, political rhetoric, geopolitical rhetoric is one thing. Language is so imprecise, which is why I wrote this report for the New Lines Institute last year called Post Khamenei Iran: The Future of Evolutionary Regime Change. And I didn't know at the time that there was going to be a war between Israel and Iran, but I identified a process whereby this regime is going to evolve from a theocracy to a more military dominated regime that sheds some of its Islamism, not all, becomes more Iranian nationalist, becomes somewhat pragmatic. And I gave the analogy in the report that this regime would sort of behave on a much smaller scale like China did when we had, the opening in the Nixon administration. China did not become a friend of the United States. We worked with China. We invested heavily. We shared technology to where China became the world's industrial plant. And that's the challenge we face today. So I think at a smaller scale, once in a scenario where things don't completely go south, you will see this regime evolve to where it will have, relations with the world, with the United States, with the West, but won't be able to call it an ally because at the end of the day, they are Iranian nationalists. Iran has a very long sense of history. The an imperial history where Iran and Persia, the classical name of the nation, was an empire, and so they will continue to pursue those ambitions. How they do that, we don't know. But I think the era of when you would have sort of hardcore theocracy and hardcore Islamist ideology, I think that is sort of that has come to an end. We're at the tail end of that. That doesn't mean that Iran won't have sort of like a radical approach to its foreign policy, but the radical approach will be tempered with doses of pragmatism, far more so than what we've seen before. Even this regime has been all about regime preservation. That's their number one imperative. So they can say a lot of things, they can do a lot of things, but at the end of the day, they're always about regime preservation. They're very calculating and mindful of that. They're very rational about that. I think that process will be furthered as we move forward in the next 1 to 2 years, 3 years. And so that means that there's already regime evolution going on. And I think that's not lost on the Israelis. That's not lost on the Americans. I don't think this administration, I mean, look, no administration going back to, post 9/11, the George W. Bush administration ever thought we could pull off regime change in Iran. And so I don't think that's on the cards. I think what the president and President Trump and the Prime Minister of Israel are saying is that it's an aspiration that, hey, if we could somehow see this regime changed, and if we can get people to change from within, then life would be far simpler for us. But will that happen? Well, what you want and what you can have are two very different things.
Yeah. Okay. There's two directions I want to go here. Maybe I want to understand the strategic importance of Azerbaijan a little bit better. And you explain this to a degree. I just want to pull on that thread a bit more. I believe Azerbaijan provides 40% of Israeli oil, strategically important to Israel. I believe they're brokering deals right now to supply energy to the new regime in Syria. And you recently wrote an article just discussing how they're playing the long game And I ask this question because Azerbaijan is probably a country that most people in the West, where I live, haven't thought much about, maybe until the war with Armenia a couple of years ago, and maybe even after that, not so much. So what is the strategic significance of Armenia? What is the long game they're playing, and what are the incentives they're hunting down?
Great question. So, look, if you look at Azerbaijan on a map, it's like right there in the South Caucasus. Its entire eastern flank hugs the Caspian Sea. To the west, it borders Armenia, and to the north, it has Russia. To the south, it has Iran, uh, and it's an energy-rich nation. For the longest time, it was encumbered. It was encumbered because, as I mentioned earlier, the Russians in the early 19th century took control of it from the Persians. The Persians lost the war, and these territories fell into the hands of the Kremlin. And it became Russified, it became Sovietized, to the point where the father of the current president, Mr. Ilham Aliyev, his father's name was Haider Aliyev, was not just an official of Azerbaijan. He was a senior official, part of the leadership of the KGB. In other words, he was a Soviet leader. So, that tells you sort of how influential the Azeris have been historically, even under what we would consider sort of colonial rule. And they were part. They were not just sort of a fiefdom of the Soviets and the Russians. They were stakeholders in it. And so when the Soviet Union implodes, that creates an opportunity for this country to become independent and start to look around and say, okay, what does our neighborhood look like? And it immediately starts to become an energy exporter. But at the same time, it's bogged down in a war with Armenia over the region called Nagorno-Karabakh that the Armenians in 1994 were able to take a big chunk of and take control of it. It all throughout the 90s and the 2000s, this was still a Russian sphere of influence. The Soviet Union had imploded, but Russia still had influence in the region. The Russians subdued the Chechen rebellion. The Russians invaded Georgia in 2008. And the Russians would sort of mediate between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis. And this continued literally until COVID, the year of COVID, 2020. During that year, we had a very strange development. We see Turkey, which historically, if you go back to the Ottoman era, did not sort of project influence that far east. So their influence, even in the heyday of the Ottoman Empire, sort of was restricted to the coastal areas of the Black Sea, meaning Armenia, Georgia, and so on and so forth. Azerbaijan, as I said earlier, was in the hands of the Persians. But what they did is they provided military and intelligence assistance to the Azerbaijanis, who are sort of fellow Turkic people. Azerbaijanis are, cousins of the Turks. They're both Turkic. Their language is mutually intelligible. The only difference is Azerbaijan, from a sectarian point of view, is Shia majority, while the Turks are Sunnis. But barring that aside, what the Turks did is they supported them with drones, intelligence, and other military assistance, and basically reversed the balance of power in the South Caucasus. When Azerbaijan took back large chunks of Nagorno-Karabakh from the Armenians. And that was at the tail end of 2020. It took another 3 years for them to consolidate that. And now we're looking at sort of a peace agreement in the making between the two countries. So the point I'm making is that Azerbaijan gained a lot of confidence because of that. Azerbaijan sees itself as a rising middle power. Azerbaijan, over the years, while it was developing relations with Turkey, also developed very close relations with Israel because they have a common adversary, Iran. And mind you, while the Iranians tried to use the sectarian card, the Shia religious card, to expand its influence north of the border in Azerbaijan and being an ally of the Armenians at the same time. That was a threat to the Azeris, which sort of pushed them towards a common cause with the Israelis. But at the same time, there's also ethnic Azeris who are on the other side of the Azerbaijan-Iran border. They're, as I said, they're about a quarter of the population of Iran. That's a sizable, minority. The supreme leader himself is ethnically Azeri. I mean, even though he's, sees Azerbaijan as a hostile enemy state, but nonetheless, this was the situation with Armenia sorted out now, and Russia weakened by the Ukraine war. And so now you see even Azerbaijan asserting itself against Russia to the point where the Kremlin spokesman came out 2 days ago acknowledging that the relationship between the two countries has floundered and they're trying to fix it. This is an area that, the magnitude of change is massive. This is an area that the Russians dominated for a long, long time. And now the country that they dominated, Azerbaijan, is pushing back against Russia. There's the Israeli-Iran war has weakened Iran even further. And so both on the northern and southern flank of Azerbaijan, you have opportunity. You mentioned oil supplies to Israel and gas supplies, potential supplies to Syria. Well, there is a corridor that the Turks and the Azerbaijanis are trying to construct. It's called the Zangezur corridor that runs from Azerbaijan through southern Armenia to Turkey and beyond. And that's sort of something that the Iranians see as a national security threat for themselves. But for Azerbaijan, it's their connection to the outside world. It is that sort of bottleneck that is being opened up. And you have sort of on the other side of the Caspian, you have what is called the middle corridor, which bypasses Russian territory, linking Central Asia through the Caspian Sea, through Azerbaijan, Armenia, through Turkey, to the high seas in Europe and beyond. So you have sort of this geoeconomic artery that is being developed. So these are the reasons why Azerbaijan is very important and why Azerbaijan is, looking at itself as not just a small country, hugging the Caspian and sandwiched between Russia and Iran. It sees itself as being much more than that.
And so, so a couple things at play. Thank you for that. That was excellent. And if I were to do a poor summary, I would say what we've seen is the receding of influence of two nations that have been very influential in the past, obviously Iran through the Persian Empire and Russia after that. Both of those powers are receding in influence in Azerbaijan. Simultaneously, Azerbaijan is increasing their alliances with two very powerful nations being Turkey and Israel. And from a geographic standpoint, they're a bit of a bridge, right? This corridor, and I can't recall the corridor that you just referenced that goes through effectively southern Armenia from Azerbaijan that would connect Central Asia to Europe. Is that the significance of this corridor?
Yeah, so it's called, I have a report on this from October of 2023 on our website at the New Lines Institute. It's called the Trans-Caspian International Transportation Corridor. The short form is the middle corridor. It runs from, all through, Central Asia and goes through the Caspian Sea into Azerbaijan and making its way through Turkey to the rest of the world. Now, there is a link of it. So this was a bottleneck because of the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia that didn't really get settled until 2023, and we're still under, having peace negotiations as we speak. That part of it is called the Zangezur corridor. It's a small corridor that runs through, the southern border, all along the border of Iran and Azerbaijan, through Armenia's southern Armenia and off to Turkey. Mm-hmm. And that, if that bottleneck can be resolved, then you have, that's a massive change in the broader economic corridor called the Middle Corridor, which runs from Central Asia through the South Caucasus to the West. It connects. I mean, keep in mind that Central Asia has always been sort of one of those places that has been isolated from the West, and because it's landlocked, and it has, to the north is Russia, and to the east is China, and it's sort of sandwiched between those two great powers. And these changes that are taking place in the South Caucasus are essentially enabling this region, Central Asia, to be connected to the outside world. And if somehow Iran changes, and let's assume that there's some sort of understanding between the United States and Iran that leads to geoeconomic activity and lifting of sanctions, then you can see how the full length of Iran running north-south also becomes a corridor for Central Asia to actually access the high seas, the Indian Ocean basin through the Persian Gulf. So it's this sort of the location of this region that is very consequential and will have serious implications, not just for security, but for economics and trade, especially in an age where trade is being exponentially enabled and powered by technology.
I just found myself thinking about the advantage of consolidation. Maybe not a politically correct thing to say, but when you control a continent coast to coast, how much quicker you can progress and grow versus, Europe, a continent that continually descends into war, similar with the Middle East. So many different ethnicities, ideologies, religious groups, sects, temporary borders. Let me ask you a silly question. When you talk about the middle corridor, what exactly are we talking about? Trade routes, pipelines, roads. Could you add some context to that?
Yeah, so there is no one route. It is a series of routes that run through Central Asia that consists of railroad connections, highways that sort of run through Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and sort of make their way to. So there are two ports on the Caspian Sea. One is the port of Aktau, which is in Kazakhstan, and the other is Baku, which is the capital of Azerbaijan. So that's sort of the connection. So in the current moment, in the wake of sort of Russia's war on Ukraine, the Azerbaijanis, they're an oil exporting nation. They have been trying to increase the volume of oil that they can ship through the Caspian to Azerbaijan to the broader international markets. So the connection between Aktau and Baku is sort of that maritime connection that links all the network of highways in Central Asia that sync up to Aktau and then go to Baku, and then you resume the land journey through the South Caucasus, through Turkey, and then out to the Mediterranean. So that's the corridor that I'm talking about. So it's a series of highways and rail transportation networks that all sort of sync together. So it's called the Middle Corridor because the Northern Corridor runs through Russian territory. The logic is, how can you bypass Russian territory? And so in the long run, and here's something, which is sort of significant from a strategic point of view, is that the areas that are near the parts of Central Asia that are closer to the Caspian Sea are still sort of beyond sort of the true potential of the Chinese BRI. The Chinese BRI is more closer to its borders. Say in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, the Chinese have built pipelines. There is a gas pipeline that connects Turkmen gas to China, and it runs through the length of or the breadth of Central Asia. So you have Chinese BRI, and then you have this middle corridor that the West is more interested in. In a future scenario, there's nothing saying that the Chinese won't use this corridor as well. It won't be to the benefit. But what the Russians look at it and say, well, look, this hurts our monopoly, because right now, if there is land trade, it goes from China to the rest of the world, then it goes through our territory, which is the northern sort of corridor, if you will. And so this is why this middle corridor is important. But there, as I said, there are so many geopolitical bottlenecks. And even if you didn't have geopolitics, just the sheer magnitude of logistics and getting everybody to sink into, think about Canadian-U.S. trade, how seamless it is, even though there's a long border, but there's an established protocols that don't exist in Central Asia. So, customs, how do you process trucks and, trains carrying goods and whatnot, that infrastructure is still under development.
Yeah. Okay. That's clear. In terms of military control of the Caspian Sea, how influential is Russia today? They obviously have a massive chunk of the border. What are the key obstacles between Azerbaijan and the Kazakhs connecting?
So that's a great question. So I think it was in the last couple of days that the Russians and the Iranians did some naval exercises, joint naval exercises in the Caspian.
Interesting.
And it's in their interest because both are weak. They need to demonstrate, there's not a whole lot that they can do for each other. Yes, the Iranians were supplying drones to the Russians to fight in Ukraine, but then Iran got hit, and so it's not in a position to continue that level of support. Meanwhile, the Iranians are looking at Russia and saying, hey, well, you didn't really come to our aid when Israel was attacking us. So this is okay, what can we do together? So there is sort of that military exercise that's going on. But certainly, all things being equal, if Russia wasn't bogged down in Ukraine, if Iran did not have the problems that it has and has had for many decades, there's something called the International North-South Transportation Corridor that runs from Russia through the South Caucasus, through the entire length of the Caucasus. It has a maritime route that runs through the Caspian Sea into Iran and then off to the Persian Gulf. India is very interested in that corridor as well. They've been doing some work to develop the port of Shah Bahar, which is at the mouth of the Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. But again, they're encumbered because Iran is under sanctions and so is Russia. So from their joint point of view, this east-west trans-Caspian corridor, known as the Middle Corridor, isn't exactly thrilling. It's a challenge for them. And of course, as I mentioned, the South Caucasus artery that still needs to be fleshed out, the Zangezur corridor, is immediately on the Iranian border, and they see this as compromising their territorial integrity as well. So there are all sorts of these complications, but ultimately, because where the Russians and the Iranians are in the current moment, there isn't much they can do about it.
Okay. Thank you for that. I think I want to switch regions now, and just because you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative's influence was somewhat limited in this region. Belt and Road Initiative, like quick summary, might be $1 trillion, just over $1 trillion has been invested in around 150 countries. Since about 2013, China's been investing in key infrastructure projects all over the world. And these are typically loans. And I think the idea here has been China came through 2008, realized the biggest customers of all their products, being America and Europe, were suddenly on life support and had no appetite for Chinese manufactured goods, or as much as they did 2 years earlier. And so China wanted to hedge their bets and build up the next generation of consumers in other countries. And the strategy they employed was by investing in key infrastructure to bring countries that weren't participating in a meaningful way in the global economy to be able to do so through whatever ports, refineries, processing plants, mining, roads and railways to a certain degree as well. Is that an accurate description? And then I might add, I also viewed this, I understand the economic incentive for China, but I also saw it maybe through a competitive lens because the United States has employed a parallel strategy for a longer period of time, but I would call it weapons diplomacy. And if China's provided infrastructure loans to 150 countries, well, the United States provides weapons to about 97 countries, and sort of for the same reason, right? They want future allies in a potential conflict with an adversary. They want more people to take their side than the adversary. United States weapons diplomacy, China Belt and Road Initiative. Is that a fair summary? And what did I miss?
No, it's a fair summary, but there's sort of this complication that the Chinese face. So let's pick apart the BRI. So there are certain segments of the BRI that have been sort of the largest chunk of the broader initiative, the broader Belt and Road Initiative. One is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor that runs from Xinjiang in in western China, all through the length of Pakistan to the Arabian Sea. They've, allocated something in the neighborhood of $62 billion. I think they've spent close to 50. But because of the economic and financial and security problems of Pakistan and the political problems of Pakistan that the Pakistanis are trying to get out of, that project hasn't produced the results. So the return on investment is not there. And likewise, if you swing over to Myanmar, there was something called the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. And that ran through sort of Kunming, that region in China, all the way through Myanmar to the Bay of Bengal in the northwest, the northeast Indian Ocean basin. And so what they've experienced is Myanmar has actually is a country that's fallen apart. So there are 5 different rebel groups across the country that have taken over territory from the military government. And the Chinese find themselves between these different rebel groups, mediating between them and the government and trying to keep the place going. If you look at sort of where the ports, the ports in Myanmar and the ports in Pakistan, they were sort of the two ends of what the Chinese and others have called the string of pearl strategy for the Indian Ocean basin, which sort of connects Myanmar to Bangladesh, to Sri Lanka, to the Maldives, to Pakistan. And that also has sort of run into obstacles. The biggest one that we saw was when Sri Lanka defaulted on its loan a few years ago. Mm-hmm. If you sort of swing to sort of the BRI in Central Asia, I think that's probably the most developed. And there also, you have to understand sort of the logic by which the Chinese have been operating. So the Chinese have never deployed a multi-divisional force beyond their borders. And to put things in context, the Chinese started BRI in Central Asia. President Xi Jinping announced the launch of the BRI in Kazakhstan. And, obviously he wanted sort of this BRI not just to sort of connect them through the maritime waters of Asia, but more largely the broader Eurasian landmass. And Central Asia is a key part of that. But the reason why they were able to do it is because from 2013 until 2021 August, the United States was making sure that black hole of Afghanistan that sort of sucks in all the energy from the surrounding regions was sort of in check, if you will, for lack of a better term. In other words, whatever happened in Afghanistan stayed in Afghanistan more or less because the U.S. military was there, along with the allies of NATO, and so that. In other words, the Chinese built their BRI in Central Asia and in Pakistan at the same time because the U.S. was taking care of Afghanistan. Now, with the U.S. pullout, mm-hmm. Afghanistan is up, is a strategic vacuum that's radiating uncertainty and the Chinese are trying to deal with it, but they haven't found a way. Meantime, Pakistan has also, as I said, floundered in terms of internal security, especially its sort of western flank, west of the Indus, which is along the full border of Afghanistan and, of course, Iran as well. So that's a major challenge for the Chinese that they don't have a solution for. Chinese workers have been attacked multiple times in Pakistan over the years, to the point where the Chinese have been pressuring the Pakistanis that, hey, let us bring our own security forces to guard our people. And the Pakistanis have been pushing back. And so this is a conundrum. Now, 6 months, give or take 6 months before, actually 5 months, in March of 2021, the current foreign minister of China, Mr. Wang Yi, flew to Iran and met with his Iranian counterpart, and they announced something that was phenomenal. They announced a deal worth $400 billion that China would invest to extend the BRI that is in Central Asia through the full length of Iran, connecting it to the Persian Gulf. And it was supposed to be it was like a wow moment. Okay, so the Chinese are now putting money in. But the Chinese were hoping that, hey, let's park ourselves here. Let's prepare for the time when we can actually do business without worrying about secondary and primary sanctions on Iran. But then something else happened, which is that 5 months later, the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan. And that whole thing just sort of froze. And we haven't heard anything about it since, for good reason, because, the world has changed. What China's own BRI network in Central Asia, is still subject to whatever happens to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that instability is expanding or spilling over into even Tajikistan, which is on its border with China's border, where you have the restive province of Xinjiang. Now, there's another problem that the Chinese have, and that's in their MO, the way they go into different countries. They want to go into countries that, for a lack of a better term, are malleable. In other words, they're weak. They need what China has to offer. They're ready to do business on whatever terms, are there. And the Chinese come in. Logic says that if Chinese putting cash in that country should be able to turn the country around. But what it does is it further indebts those countries. And you see Zambia, you see Sri Lanka, you look at, Pakistan. Now, Pakistan is, the Chinese are rolling over loans. There are estimates that the Chinese, the Pakistani debt to the Chinese is well over $50 billion. And so this is a problem that the Chinese have not been able to solve. So you want to go into countries that don't push back and will not negotiate or drive a hard bargain. For that, you need a country that's weak, and you hope that, hey, this will create a sphere of influence for us. It's similar to the strategy in African countries, where it's very extractive. And you see that those countries go from bad to worse. And this is something the Chinese have not figured a way around. In a country like Kazakhstan, which is far more robust, you see pushback. So it's more of a negotiation. It's more of, okay, so, let's bargain on this. And there's pushback. I mean, Daniel Markey, in his book on this topic of China's push to a westward push towards Eurasia, on the Eurasian landmass, talks about, this xenophobia in Kazakhstan, where they're suspicious of the Chinese. And, any country that's doing well, like the Kazakhs, they're going to look at this and say, well, we don't have to accept these terms. We're not in dire need. We're not Pakistan. We're not Myanmar. And so the Chinese run into sort of their ability to do business runs into sort of natural obstacles. But if they want to go into countries that have less resistance, offer less resistance, the results are even worse. So where you drop your money in and you're trying to retrieve it, and you can't.
Let me ask you a question about the BRI. You hinted at this. There's two main schools of thought that I encounter that describe what the real goal of the Belt and Road Initiative is. And the first would be its economic olive branch. We're looking at undeveloped nations, trying to help them develop, because if they succeed, we succeed alongside and more, because they become customers of our products. It's just good business. That's one. The second will be more of a debt diplomacy, which you hinted at here. And about 80%, I believe, of the countries who have accepted Chinese loans are sort of distressed balance sheet nations, highly likely to default on those loan terms. And the results of that would be that China would take control of key infrastructure in over 100 strategic nations around the world, which would be massively influential, right? That would be a huge coup. It's sort of like, a modern spin on colonialism, right? It's we're putting roots down left, right, and center in this diplomatic way. Having said that, you're going to default. Sri Lanka was a classic example. They did forfeit the port over to China, but I believe that was, a bit more going on there, right? Sri Lanka went through crazy problems and just 2 years ago, they defaulted on that $50 billion note. A country that imports 92% of its energy, no cash, no credit, no power, rolling blackouts. The president had to flee the country 2 days after this occurred. It's a mess. But outside of Sri Lanka, 80% of the countries are still distressed nations from a balance sheet standpoint, likely to default, and that puts China in a very strategic position. Two schools of thought. Where do you land on this, Cameron?
So I think I agree with your earlier explanation that you mentioned that has to do with the 2008-09 financial crisis.
Okay.
That where so if you look at the geoeconomics in sort of broad strokes of China, it's an exporting nation, and it needs to maintain full employment. The legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and that entire regime is don't talk about politics. We don't care what you do at the social level. We don't have any ideology. We don't have any social norms that we expect from you. But don't talk about politics and we'll give you prosperity. That's sort of the unwritten social contract that the Chinese have with their people. The way that they've done that is to become the industrial plant of the world. And that was largely fueled by, the opening with China, with the United States in the 70s, leading, to the investments of the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. And here we are. Now, that model assumes one thing. It assumes that the world will not catch a cold, there won't be recessions because if you have recessions, and 2008 was a wake-up call for them, that they said, oh, wow, okay, so appetite for people don't have money for imports, demand is down, and, that's not good. How do we maintain full employment? So BRI, as you rightly put, was sort of this alternative. It's Chinese money being given to other nations, but the infrastructure is built by Chinese workers. In other words, Chinese companies are the ones doing the work. And so it was sort of a very unique model as a workaround, as a potential workaround, the fact that demand for Chinese goods had gone down. And if you notice, those high GDP growth rates that the Chinese, experienced for the bulk, well into the 2000s, the late 2000s, we haven't seen a return to them. So, we to the point now where you have China's economy, it's now mainstream view that the Chinese economy is in turmoil, serious turmoil, and needs serious structural changes, reforms that the regime doesn't know how to impose without sort of rattling political stability. And then on top of that, you have what the current leader of China, President Xi, has done is turn a bureaucratized and institutionalized authoritarian regime, a regime of collective leadership. This is what the lieutenants and the aides of Mao did, is that they went from one guy calling the shots to a collective leadership and created sort of a mechanism that worked, that brought prosperity, immense prosperity to China. What Xi has done is personalize that collective leadership with this unprecedented third term and these purges that don't seem to end. They extend into the PLA and the CCP. I mean, obviously, the word is this is corruption. You ask yourself, "Wow, you must be really corrupt to be able to say to have these many people getting fired, these many senior people." And currently, President Xi is actually removing, or the system is actually removing people who Xi brought himself to replace others. So we're now in sort of 2.0 version of the purges. So you look at all of that and you say, okay, is this really working? Is this shift really working? And I don't think it is working. And then on top of that, going back to sort of, the first Trump administration, and then of course the Biden administration continued and built on it, and now Trump with his tariffs is further sort of building on the pressure, where the United States is basically saying, look, we can't do business with you guys while you are also challenging us militarily. So this just doesn't work. We want to do business with you, but look what you're doing on the military front. You weaponized technology and investments against us. And so that's the challenge for the United States, is to how to get out of this. Because of the way in which the Chinese have sort of dominated like critical mineral sector, electric vehicles, solar panels, just to name a few. And so this sort of positioning is something that the Chinese have going for themselves. But at the same time, it's all dependent on a political economic structure that continues to bring prosperity to the average Chinese, so which maintains stability. And in many ways, the CCP has to get to the other side, whatever that looks like, post Xi. Do they go back to collective leadership? How do they solve their housing crisis and sort of the local government non-performing loans problems? So they also are due for change, and so I think that BRI, yes, you've sort of done this where 100 some countries owe you a lot of money. How are you going to enforce it? It's kind of like people owe money to credit cards, and then they can't pay them, and then collection agencies come after them. Chinese don't have collection agencies. You need military force to be able to knock on somebody's door and say, pay up. And so,
or to reclaim that infrastructure, right?
Or to reclaim that infrastructure.
Right.
Well, you're going to say, okay, we're going to take over the port in Sri Lanka, and India has something to say about that.
Yeah,
you can't do that in its backyard. Not that the Indians have a solution for it, but you see the challenges that they have. So I don't think that the BRI model has worked out the way the Chinese have wanted, because A, it has not produced the intended outcomes. B, other complications have arisen in the meantime.
What do you make? Did you hear about that? One of their projects was in Ethiopia. They built the African Union building in Addis Ababa. And I think in 2015, the overnight security figured out that data was being transferred from the local servers to, I think, Shenzhen in the middle of the night. And upon thorough investigation, they found a bunch of hidden microphones in the walls and in the chairs of the building. And obviously all this information seemingly was being funneled back to Shenzhen. Did you hear that story? And how do you process something like that?
I would say that was 10 years ago, and now 10 years later, especially with AI and whatnot, the problem has become exponentially larger. I know that Huawei has helped the Turkmen government to set up a national level surveillance state, where literally, that's how they do crowd control. And obviously Turkmenistan is one of those very isolated countries, probably one of the most, if not the most. We know far more about what happens in North Korea.
Yeah. People that don't know, Turkmenistan is like the epitome of a hermit nation, correct? It's like it's
exactly
sealed off.
It's like 6 million people, but lots of natural gas reserves. They only have one large customer right now, which is China. And speaking of debt, so they owe money to Beijing, and so they get paid by China for the natural gas. Then they have to sort of pay back because they also owe money. So it's a very precarious, vicious cycle there, which the current president is trying to sort. Who took over from his father a few years ago, to try to sort out. But it's stuck with the Chinese. So yes, I mean, I would say that intelligence collection through technology. I think we just sort of scratch the surface of or the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we don't know the full extent of what the Chinese are doing. We get reports every now and then about potential penetration by the Chinese and spying and whatnot, economic espionage and data espionage and whatnot. But if they're doing things like DeepSeek and whatnot, we have to assume that this problem is much bigger than is generally known or is reported.
Let me ask you a question. Here's how I sort of digest the Chinese political structure, and I'd love to know what you think about this. And a few things that you mentioned, don't talk about politics, and we promise you prosperity, right? That's the trade we're making. There's a relatively high amount of social freedom, relative amount of corporate freedom, but they are politically captive, right? I think that's pretty clear. And the parallel that I draw therefore is like, oh, that's like a corporation, right? I give my people a ton of autonomy. I don't micromanage. I set a vision, and that's non-negotiable. It's not a democracy. My word is law. But if we work together, we're all going to make a bunch of money together, right? So let's do this. And that's the way I understand the Chinese regime. You think that's accurate, or what are your thoughts?
I think that's a great analogy. I think that there is a problem that is evolutionary for the Chinese. So it's sort of a natural evolution. If you say, we don't really care what you do at the societal level, do you get married, not married, what clothes you wear, what religion, and so on and so forth, as long as it's not subversive to the ideology of the state. It's a lot of room for maneuver at the social level. People are free to do whatever they want. What that does is that it creates, especially in this technological and hyper-connected world that we live in, is that people get attracted to ideas. People look and say, okay, especially if the economic provinces are floundering, if you're not delivering, if unemployment is going up and repression is going up. I mean, look at the DeepSeek AI, the LLM that the Chinese have put out. I mean, the LLM isn't going to tell you anything that's against the Chinese state. So, I mean, this is sort of hardwired and coded into it. So that gives you a sense of sort of how control is being maintained and the paranoia of the state when it comes to politics. But you can't tell people you're socially free to do whatever. We're giving you prosperity. Enjoy your life. People at some point want more, especially when the social evolution reaches a state where political consciousness comes in. And now you also have a person who's trying to sort of dominate the entire system. That has to be problematic for many of the elites as well, which is why you have these purges. And so there has to be pushback from the elite. And yeah, I mean, you have this security state, the Ministry of Security Services, MSS, Chinese intelligence. You have the PLA that dominates the local law enforcement or national police force. You have all of that. But at the end of the day, this isn't something that's sustainable. At some point, and especially if you are not fulfilling your end of the bargain, or you're finding it harder to deliver, then that whole thing about, hey, I wish we had freedom, I wish we had some democratic rights, that becomes not just a luxury nice to have, it becomes an imperative at some point when the economics don't work out. And so I think that that social contract is going to come under stress because this thing is not sustainable. This is a very abnormal autocratic system that, I mean, China is one of those unique autocracies that has actually shown economic prosperity. And in the third world, you see people from different nations who have actually gone and studied in China, whether they studied engineering or the social sciences or whatnot. They come back and they say, they sing the praises of the Chinese model. But reality is there isn't a model to export. There isn't a
Yeah.
sort of this political economic model to export because it's a patchwork of something that is unique to the Chinese circumstances.
Yes, that makes sense. And because you can look at recent history and make that case, right? In 1990, I think China had the GDP of like Italy, right? Effectively a nation of rice field villages, right? And within 30 years, they're the top contender for global supremacy. So you could take that message to any developed nation, especially when you're offering loans for infrastructure and say, look what we did for ourselves. We can do this for you too, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, well, the evidence is right in front of me. Clearly, this is an ally I should protect. So I understand that argument, but that's not an exportable model. It doesn't work like that.
There's also the issue of wages. I mean, if you look at the life cycle of wages, so the generation that rose under near double digit growth rates, they were okay with low wages.
Right.
But we're now 40 years out from that.
Yeah.
Okay. There's another generation. Expectations have gone up. Because once you create prosperity, you generate wealth. Wealth creates expectation of what a wage is. So you're no longer, that low wage. And, for investors, I mean, it's still competitively with the West and other parts of the world, it's still there because what the Chinese have done is they've done at scale that we can build things at scale and the costs are still low. But the expectation from the Chinese population has gone up. Sure, there's still sort of, the rural areas and, the urban areas that are packed with people who, are day laborers and whatnot, or just sort of like, they work in factories and so on and so forth. But the thing is that expectations also rise. So if your system does not cater to the expectation of the people that you're ruling, then that also is a fault line.
That's I love that. It reminded me of Dalio's model, where, productivity leads to wealth. Wealth leads to expectations. A poor country that knows they're poor is willing to work hard with low expectations. But if they continuously work hard and organize, they will build wealth. But for a period of time, they'll still think of themselves as poor. And that's the sweet spot. Low expectations, high productivity. As generations pass, you're wealthy and you're wealthy and expectations skyrocket. Usually productivity declines on that same timeline. We've seen that.
There's also the element of meritocracy. So there's a weird meritocracy that existed for several decades from the takeoff of China on this sort of becoming this industrial plant of the world to the here and now. And that is that, or let's say to the arrival of Xi and his presidency, is that you could go from the local village or town and work your way up through the Chinese Communist Party. And if you were smart, you were savvy, you showed promise, you got promoted, and you rose through the ranks to the top leadership. You could, and it doesn't have to be sort of political leadership. You could be sort of, if you had sort of interest in being a military officer, you went through the PLA. If you were great at engineering, you were given the leadership of a manufacturing facility or whatever. I'm just sort of throwing examples out there. There was a meritocracy, and the meritocracy wasn't sort of like, if you will, on Western standards, but it still existed where there was a chance for upward social mobility. But if that system is no longer allowing you to get up there because the system is constricted, Xi and his loyalists are the ones who are dominating the superstructure. And then it sort of trickles down, that loyalty dynamic trickles down all the way. You're not getting the best and the brightest because you want the best and brightest, but you also want loyal. So it's a trade-off. So that's another wrinkle in this system.
Yeah. Okay. Now, one thing you mentioned a minute ago, the standpoint of the United States has largely been, we want to do business with you, but we can't if you're challenging us militarily. And I want to dive into that a little bit. You flag me if you got to go, Cameron. I'll keep you all day, man. We'll just keep going. But when you got to go, you tell me.
I just have to leave in like 10 minutes or so.
All right, we're going to blitz this then. So I want to just get your assessment on how military strength stacks up between the United States and China right now. And I maybe look at this through the lens of, here's a couple of things I'd say, and then I want to hear your perspective. United States is largely understood to have the most powerful military in the world. And I think from an advanced weapons standpoint, I agree with that. Where I struggle with it, though, is that if we're being really critical, can we say definitively that America's won a war since 1942? Look, I don't know that they have, right? Lots of skirmishes, confusing outcomes. It's been complex. But what I would point to is that leading up to World War II, America was not the most advanced military in the world by any stretch, but they were the most advanced manufacturing country in the world. And that was their strategic advantage. Their output outpaced any of their adversaries on the map in World War II. They're no longer that manufacturing powerhouse. And yes, they have advanced military, but they lack the ability to produce that quickly or anything at scale. In addition, over 92% of those advanced weapons are reliant on inputs they can only get from China. And I'm talking about the array of rare earth metals, which in reality aren't rare whatsoever, but it's the processing of those that's incredibly rare. And 96% of that occurs inside China. So can you build the weapons to defend yourself if you need inputs that can only come from your adversary? But as a consequence of that, I see a US-China conflict as like a non-starter, because if I've got a gun pointed at you, you're not going to sell me the bullets, right? And if I can't build advanced weapons without your inputs, and I know there's efforts back home to build rare earth processing in the US, and it's going to happen, but it's going to be tough because these are dirty projects. You need environmental concessions. You need billions of dollars. You need a decade of testing, 15 years of testing to get it right. And in a democracy that thinks in 2-year election cycles, that's really hard to do. Is the political will, does it exist in the United States where in an autocracy, you could just push forward policy, whatever you want, right? Which kind of struck me as one of the reasons the American president is deepening ties with the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, because if they can borrow the political will, and I know, Ma'aden, Saudi Arabian mining company, and MP Materials in the US now have a memorandum of understanding to build like full suite supply chain manufacturing for rare earths in the kingdom. So you can maybe borrow political will from a neighbor like that. But that's kind of my quick and dirty synopsis. What's your take, Cameron?
So absolutely, this is a dependency and I wrote a piece in Forbes a couple of weeks ago on this, on how we can reduce our dependency on, and this exposure. This is a very high risk exposure to China, and to where 90% of the supplies are from China, or the global supplies. So that's a process, as you laid out. It takes years to build that. Australia is another potential partner in this. Kazakhstan is the one that I mentioned in my piece for Forbes, is another. You mentioned Saudi Arabia. There are rare earth deposits that need to be, examined and looked at in the United States. I think that will take time. But yes, you're right in terms of, sort of that mutual dependency. I don't think the Chinese are in a position to, let's say, attack Taiwan. Because if they attack Taiwan, they have seen what has happened to Russia in Ukraine. So, Taiwan is one of the largest manufacturers of semiconductors of the world, top 2. So the world isn't going to sort of say, oh, well, what can we do about it? So the Chinese know this. The Chinese economy is also very dependent on the goodwill of the world, as we just discussed. I mean, it's an export economy. So for these reasons, I don't think that they are going to attack Taiwan anytime soon, because of the way they are dependent on the world, and then of course the way in which the United States has the ability to sanction and impose really crippling sanctions. If you look at, and the evidence for this behavior is, what have they done for Russia? Not much. I mean, they haven't condemned Ukraine. That's one thing, but you know, who have the Russians been able to lean on? The North Koreans and the Iranians. So if your top priority is to win the war in Ukraine, and this limitless partnership that you keep talking about with China, so what is it doing to help you achieve that goal? So I think that the Chinese know their constraints. But the problem that I am talking about in terms of a military threat isn't one of intentions, because nations prepare for war and conflict and deal with threats based on capabilities and potential capabilities. So that's where the hardware that the Chinese are churning out, the military hardware, becomes significant. And the scale at which they're doing. I mean, there's like a massive gap between shipbuilding in the United States and what China is churning out. So the United States just can't sort of say, oh, okay, you're locked in, you're not going to attack Taiwan. That's right now. But there's no way to fully game this out, war game it. And that's where, the world, human history is replete with examples of nations being surprised by behavior of others. And so some of them were predictable, but, a lot of times you're surprised. Certainly the Japanese, when they attacked Pearl Harbor, did not think that the United States would be able to hit them back and hard. The other part is the way in which the World War II was fought, and the manufacturing aspect of the United States, or prowess, and the world of today. So just to give you a small example, because we're running out of time, aircraft carriers, carrier strike groups, carrier battle groups are a very World War II, 20th century way of having global power projection capability. The big question that is being asked now is, in an age of swarming drones fueled by AI, with actors like the Houthis interdicting maritime traffic, what is the value of an aircraft carrier? An aircraft carrier is like a target-rich environment for these drones. And so I think the logic of war and how war is being fought is also evolving and changing. I mean, we had an F-18 go overboard because of a heartabout, because of incoming from the Houthis. So that's a scenario that I'm sure the U.S. military is very practiced and experienced and is always training. And it's not something they probably had sort of factored in that, hey, what if, should we have a protocol to lock the planes down in a hostile environment? That's not something they thought of, because otherwise, you can't explain why the F-18 went overboard in the Arabian Sea. And so the world is changing in all. How you do economics, technology has reshaped how we do, the human condition at large, not just warfare or economics. And so I think that the rules of the last 70, 80 years, we can't use them as assumptions anymore in order to understand how things will play out in the future. The last point I want to make is that there is an overemphasis in the public debate globally when it comes to warfare on hardware. And there is an underappreciation for humanware. What do I mean by that? That we measure the prowess of a country by the number of aircraft that it's producing, the type, its capabilities, its missile capabilities, how fast they can go, et cetera, hard numbers. But it's one thing to have the hardware. It's another thing to have the humanware, which means that you have you actually have used them. In other words, why is it that the U.S. has has this global maritime presence? Because it's been doing it for almost 2 centuries. Mm-hmm. And so the Chinese don't have that practice. So they still need time. Blue water navigation requires, admiralty and the ability to actually field ships, keep them out, maintain the supply lines, have the satellite connections, so on and so forth. It's an entire science that until you do it, you can't be sure that you'll perform. Look at the performance of the Russian military, a battle-hardened military going back to the 19th and 18th centuries, a continuous military institution with its own industrial base. We thought game over in 1 week. That was what the world gave to Ukraine when the Russians decided to attack. We're now 3.5 years out, and the Russians are stuck. Mm-hmm. That's the behavior. That's the actual performance of a military that has fought wars. Chinese have not. They've fought, the Indians in 1962. There was a war in Vietnam, 1979, and in 1969 there was a small skirmish with the Soviets. But that's about it. So These things have to be factored in if we're going to determine the actual threat that the Chinese pose.
Fair. Yes. And you made many really strong points. One that just stuck with me is, as technology and therefore warfare evolves, the pie chart of imported inputs is going to shift. We can go back and think about wars where it was pretty much the whole pie chart was land. That was the battlefield, and then land and sea, and then land, sea, and air. And then more recently, land, sea, air, and cyber. And as we move forward, cyber takes a bigger piece of the pie. And I think we now have to add space to that pie chart, right? Because
we already have.
We already have. Yes. And man, another hour on that we could, I'm sure, because what's the high leverage attack today? It's not Pearl Harbor, right? It's a satellite, knock out the global positioning system, the GPS, and what good are any aircraft carriers if you can't navigate them, right? And communicate. Okay. This has been phenomenal. I'm so glad you were able to make time to come on the show. Thanks so much for coming on, Kamran, and chatting with me and getting in front of my audience.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Love to do it again sometime. But until then, have a great day. And okay, thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Most investors think they're playing it safe, following mainstream advice, chasing trends, and clinging to the herd mentality. But there is nothing safe about mainstream advice. The smartest investors know that real wins come from thinking independently and spotting opportunities long before the crowd. And that's what we teach at the Commodity University. This is an exclusive membership designed to arm you with the skills from the sharpest minds in the mining investment world. Each of our professionals has a proven track record of finding trends before anyone else. At the Commodity University, you'll gain access to a highly curated and growing catalog of courses covering what you actually need to know to become an informed commodity investor. Every single month, you'll receive a brand new course packed with insights from the best in the business, giving you the edge to stay ahead. If you're tired of following the crowd and ready to invest smarter, think sharper, and understand the mining industry like the professionals, then take the next step and join the Commodity University today.